Welcome to the Teacher's Toolkit for Literacy, the free podcast for motivated teachers and school leaders who want to inspire their students and school community in literacy learning. Make sure you subscribe to the show on your favourite podcast player, and for more amazing literacy resources, check out the show notes provided with every episode.
Hi, I'm Sharon and I'm the host of a Teacher's Toolkit for Literacy. In every Toolkit episode, we bring you specific resources, tools, strategies, tips, techniques to help you in your job as a teacher of literacy. Firstly, we acknowledge and pay our respect to the Kaurna people, the traditional custodians whose ancestral lands we gather upon. We acknowledge the deep feelings of attachment and the relationship of the Kaurna people to country, and we respect and value their past, present, and ongoing connection to the land and cultural beliefs. Welcome to newcomers to the podcast and welcome to newcomers to the Facebook group. We love hearing the diverse reasons why teachers across the world are joining all this deep creative literacy work going on in schools. Some of the recent comments that we've snapped up: one, to develop my skills and knowledge for quality literacy teaching, from a teacher. Then from a school leader, information to better serve our students and teachers. From another teacher, I'm a science teacher but want to improve literacy skills in my students. Someone else has told us they're looking for fresh information about books and resources. And finally, one, join a passionate and encouraging community and gather and share more ideas. And that really is that last, well, all of those things, but the passionate and encouraging community is something that we have really been trying to build, really working at building through this podcast. So we're pleased that people can see that that's what they're going to be able to find within the community here. And if you're not a member of the Teacher's Toolkit Facebook group, we'd love you to join and introduce yourself to the group. Now to this podcast. This week, can writing live without reading? And we're welcoming to the podcast to help us explore this, who we refer to as the father of teaching and learning in Australia, and quite possibly the world, we would say. And so we welcome to this podcast Dr. Brian Cambourne. Welcome, Brian.
Oh, thank you for that welcome. I'm terribly flattered. I only consider myself the father of 4 children, but I do value the group of people who found my work useful and who keep teaching me about how it can be applied in today's classrooms and some of the difficulties that they face in doing this. Yes.
So your wonderful career has really spanned, your research work in particular has always been classroom-based. Yeah. And so at the University of Wollongong, where you're still an honorary principal fellow, you've published widely in articles in the Australian Literacy Educators Association journals. You've presented widely at Australian Literacy Educator Association conferences and internationally, Brian. You've been part of the International Literacy Association where you've presented, and you've also, in reference to earlier, the Citation of Merit Award for Literacy, the Garth Boomer Award. And there's another fellow person who was very classroom-based and really, learned a lot from about the real world of teaching. And I think that's the thing that, it's absolutely the reason that we have you here today, to share with us as teachers and as learners, more about this idea of what works in classrooms and why that works. But before we get there, can you talk to us a little bit about currently, you've got, or in recent years, you've been working a lot with the Foundation for Learning and Literacy, So could you tell us a little bit about that as a foundation and what its goals are there?
It began, we began thinking about this, myself and a few other educators like Jan Turnbull and Wendy Bean. We began thinking about developing what we called a think tank that would support constructivist views of teaching. And so I identified about 15 people who I knew were really strongly committed to a constructive, hands-on approach to teaching literacy, and were in agreement with the theories that I'd developed over the years. So I contacted them and said, let's have a Zoom meeting and talk about how we can put together a think tank. Well, after a series of meetings for about 6 months, they decided they didn't want a think tank, but they wanted a foundation. And they wanted to have a foundation that was based on certain principles or touchstones, which they called them, which are really the core theoretical principles of what we believe effective literacy teaching is. And then we would develop a website that would be reputable in the sense that it didn't take sides. It just put up its values in terms of the touchstones, and then would become, if you like, a reputable, objective critique, a body which would critique current research, which would deal with what we called facts rather than opinion. I tried to lead it for a while as the leader, but the women that I'd invited to join were much more efficient at running Zoom meetings and getting things done. So they made me patron, and together they, over a year or two of really hard work, got the foundation up and running the way it is now. And we're getting more and more what we call friends of the foundation who regularly look at the resources we put up there, the critiques we put up there, the good stories from schools, success stories, our critiques of the science of reading people. And we seem to be getting more and more people who want to be members and take part. So we've had a pretty good impact, I think. I'm very proud of the way that the people like Joe Padgham and Robin Ewing and Di Snowball and others who are all in the original discussions. I'm very proud of the way that it's all come together. I think we're getting a lot of attention, and a lot of other organisations want to join us or work with us. So keep your eye out for it if you haven't seen it before. And
yes, we absolutely encourage people to link with that. So the Foundation for Learning and Literacy, and to become a friend, it's free to join. And as you say, Brian, there are frequent additions made to the site where there's resources, and in fact one of the resources we are drawing on today as part of this podcast. So under all the categories of literacy, there are recommended readings or readings that have been put forth, research that's been put forth, as well as very practical writings on those topics. So they're really highly valuable powerhouses of resources for us in our in leading literacy in schools and in growing our own learning about the teaching of literacy. Brian, can you also tell us a little bit about, because I haven't even mentioned some of your core work that you've been doing over your lifetime around the conditions for learning, but in recent years you have collaborated with Deborah Crouch to write a new book around the conditions for learning, especially as they relate to literacy. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
It's I was very lucky that Deborah Crouch, who is a professional developer in America, contacted me with an email saying she was putting together a professional development program, and she wanted to introduce her clientele to the conditions of learning. Did I have anything written lately? And could I send her the latest things I'd written? So I went through my files, and I found that I really hadn't changed anything since I first put it together. So I wrote back to her and said, nothing's changed. The conditions are still essentially the same. And she said, how would you like to? And I said to her, how would you like to take what I've already written and turn it into something that's more up to date and suits you and fits in with your context? And she said, all right, I'm very interested in developing a short monograph which will explain how you can use the conditions of learning to make teaching decisions. And I said, oh, well, go for it, and I'll respond. So she did, and she wrote this monograph, which I thought was terrific. She had a framework for doing it, and she used a particular interest in the USA at that time among schools for illustrating how you could use the conditions of learning to make decisions about how you teach this particular aspect of literacy. Right. And it was terrific. So I wrote back to her and I got in touch with Richard C. Owen, and I said to him, it's about time I updated the whole story, Richard. Are you interested in being the publisher? And he said, my word, I am. And so he and I and Deborah got together by Zoom. I've never met Deborah. I can't remember meeting Deborah face to face, but she tells me way back in the 80s when she was a recently graduated infants teacher in Tennessee. Yes. She went to a workshop that I did. I can't remember her, but she can remember that. Yeah. But apart from that, we've never met face to face. And so we spent 2 years writing that book using the Zoom platform. And I mean, that's a whole new ball game too, how to teach writing on Zoom, which I'm interested in exploring further later on. But that's how it came about. And, I'm terribly lucky because she is really, she's really a terrier for getting the facts right. And if I happen to, in our drafts, make a reference or use a word sloppily, she'd pull me up and say, no, I don't like that. I think I'd rather we said it this way. And I found her notion, her familiarity with the American context, and what was happening over there now with American teachers. She was able to turn the theoretical stuff that I put in. She could turn it into classroom practice in ways that made sense. And it made sense to teachers and made sense to her audience. Yeah. So, it was really, I was really very lucky to, those events that you don't really think are going to happen fall into place. And suddenly we've got a book which is doing very well in America, not doing so well here because our teachers, well, for two reasons. Richard C. Owen can't get space in flights to get hard copies out here.
Right, yes,
and
in this current time.
Yeah.
Yes.
And most Australian teachers, anyway, New South Wales teachers, I know for sure, have been so brutalised by COVID and the stop-start. And, this day you'll be at school, now you're not at school, now we have to close the school.
Yes.
They're just worn out, they're just tired out. And getting them to do any professional development is a big ask currently, although Deborah and I have done a few webinars with Australian teachers and Australian pre-service students, which seem to go very well.
Yes.
And as a result of that, one or two of those teachers found that Amazon can get hard copies of the book out here in about 10 days.
Oh, terrific. Some more terriers, who are going to chase these things down.
Mm.
Yeah. The title of the book, again, Brian?
Made for Learning.
That's it, Made for Learning.
And it's based on the notion that as a species, sapiens was born with the ability to make meaning from abstract symbols. We're the only creature on God's earth that can do that. No other creature can do it.
Mm.
And so we really have been designed by evolution to learn to make meaning using symbols and using a whole range of symbol systems like oral language, written language, art, maths, performance, mime. And over the couple of 100,000 years we've been developing, we just can't help learning if the right conditions are in place. We can put barriers up to make learning more difficult, but we can't escape the fact that as a species we have been made to learn, and so that was the notion behind the title, that if you do things right, kids can't help learning.
Yes,
you can't turn learning on and off like a tap. They're learning all the time.
Yes, and it's our job, isn't it, really, to open those doors for that learning. So maybe we'll move into what we want to focus on today in the podcast. And as always, I always like to just introduce by thinking about what are we as teachers, what's our struggle. And so we've called today's Can Writing Live Without Reading? And when we talk about what's the teaching struggle, so teaching writing can sometimes, we can find that it can sometimes be a bit of this and a bit of that. And in current times, we're also finding that it can be a bit of, when it comes to writing, that it's got a very structured approach to it, and that we're sort of compartmentalising literacy into, we do this, so we do some writing here, which doesn't necessarily connect to the word work we might be doing here and the reading that we're doing there. And so this connection between these elements, the way some, I'll say for want of a better term, some programs that have been brought in, teachers are finding it's really compartmentalising that aspect. And so therefore, because of that, it's difficult for us to see transfer for our students across from one thing to another. So today we want to explore, is there a way to teach writing in more powerful ways, knowing that our students are made for learning? And what does the research and evidence tell us about that? So the article that is on the Foundation for Learning and Literacy, called Understanding Writing and Its Relationship to Reading, Brian, it's your reworking, well, not reworking, a bit of revision of a chapter that you wrote for the 1988 publication, The Whole Story, Natural Learning and the Acquisition of Literacy. And you had in there a chapter called Making Connections, Understanding Writing. Now, whilst that book's no longer in print, we are so privileged that you have done this revision on it and that you have shared through this chapter key messages that you believe are still as important, perhaps even more so, for understanding and teaching writing in today's classrooms. And so you've really outlined here some key messages focusing on the knowledge, attitudes and professional beliefs about writing, reading, language and learning that guide and shape our classroom practice, of which you've been, the classrooms that you've been observing and studying and learning from, over your career. So what's important for us, so Deborah's really written Made for Learning in the American context, but I really like that in this article too, you've your research has really revealed teaching and learning of writing in Australian classrooms. And so that's what we'd like to explore with you today, the things that you've, through your research and through your learning, the things that you have, things that have been revealed to you and that you can share with us. So to start us up, in looking at classrooms, what did you learn about, from a child perspective, like what makes an effective writer?
Perhaps if I go back to the beginning a bit.
Yes, yep.
It began when I first got seconded to work as a teacher educator in a pre-service course at a place called Wagga Wagga Teachers College. Mm-hmm. I can remember I would give try to give lectures on how to teach the curriculum, particularly reading and writing. And I can remember one teacher one day that I was working with said to me, "It's all very well for you to try to teach us what the theory says, mm-hmm. but don't you think it would be better for you if you, before you try to tell us what we should be doing, that you come in and have a look and see what we really are doing?" Mm. And that really struck me. I mean, that was a very brave teacher talking to, a lecturer from the Teachers College and telling him that he doesn't like being told what to do and that said lecturer should get into classrooms and see what's happening before he tried to tell us what we should be doing. Mm. And that really struck a chord with me, and I began then my career as a naturalistic researcher. That is, that I would spend hours observing what happened in classrooms, trying to understand what happened rather than doing research that relied on hypothesis testing. Yes. And so, I've done nearly 6 decades of naturalistic inquiry, they call it. Mm-hmm. I call it sitting in classrooms and trying to work out how everything links together. Mm-hmm. How does this system called the classroom work? Yes. How do these kids, what do they bring with them into this system? What is it that teachers bring into the system? And when they all get together, what happens? Can I find any threads or any links? And I've been doing that for 60-odd years. Yeah. And one of the first things that I realised was that a lot of the so-called experts who were writing about the teaching of writing were using terms like the effective writer. What is an effective writer? Mm-hmm. And they would put that question rhetorically and then try to answer it. And I realised that nowhere has anybody ever successfully been able to define operationally in a way that makes sense what an effective writer is, because they all have their own different values and perspectives, and linguists differ from psycholinguists, who differ in turn from neurolinguists, and it was just a slippery slide. And so I thought it would be much more useful if I could identify what I called an effective user of writing. Yeah. And I found that an extremely useful way of trying to help teachers understand how you can develop classroom practices which will encourage and support your students in becoming effective users of writing. Because, if you're an effective user of writing, you can use it to achieve a whole lot of aims and ends and purposes for your life, but you don't necessarily become an effective writer. You don't become a journalist. You don't necessarily write a book, but you do know how to use writing effectively to achieve what it is you want to achieve. And I think that's a much more useful way of thinking about teaching writing. How can I teach kids to be effective users of all of the purposes and ways that we can use writing to really get what we want out of life, and to really live the good life. We have to do a lot of writing, and we have to be able to use writing effectively to be able to do those things.
I like that term that you use, to lead the good life, and to actually live a writer's life.
Yeah.
The life of a writer, not just the life of the what would we say? The one that just churns out what we are thinking is expected. And that's what literacy is, isn't it? It's about choosing and using. So that word use is, so I love that. I asked what is an effective writer, but it is about, and you stress that, that it's about being an effective user of writing. And so that's how we want to construct that for our students. And as you said, it's knowing how to use it for effect and for audience and for purpose, and to be able to use it in a range of ways, not just in a singular, singular path.
The power, or the power of writing differs in different historical eras. At one time, to be an effective user of writing, you had to be able to write pamphlets. As we move through time, coming up to the modern era, we're finding lots of other uses that writing can be put to. The whole Facebook, social media world is something that I know nothing about. How do you write for Facebook? How do you write for TikTok? How do you write for Instagram? I don't know how to do that. I'd have to really get some good instruction or support if someone put me back in a classroom now and I was trying to teach kids how to use writing for those purposes. I'd be okay teaching them how to write essays, or how to write a letter to the editor, or how to fill out a form for the ombudsman and so on. But I'm just not up to date with how the kind of writing that people are currently engaging in, and it is becoming a very powerful means of persuasion and coercion.
Yes. So really, you're talking there about so to be effective, an effective user of writing, you need to have confidence in the types, or in the uses of writing.
One thing that emerged from all of the classrooms that I observed was that the kids that I felt were really effective users of writing were also very confident that they could use writing to achieve what it was they wanted to do.
Yeah.
And I had to ask the question, who gave them this confidence? How do you develop that confidence? And it became obvious that the classroom language, the metaphors, the bond between classroom and classroom pupils and their teacher and so on were all very important aspects that had to be in place for this confidence to emerge. And so the classrooms that I thought were doing this were classrooms that fulfilled Michael Halliday's famous, the linguist, his what I call his trifecta. He once said, we learn language, we learn through language, and we learn to use language simultaneously as we use it. And that's really what good classrooms are about. You create learning opportunities which enable the kids to use language, to study language, to share language, to talk about language. And that means that you can, you're not necessarily teaching writing per se, but you're creating opportunities for kids to read, write, talk, listen, share. Yeah. And in that way, they learn about how to be an effective user of writing. So I would recommend, if you haven't, if your teachers haven't read Michael Halliday's stuff on language and learning, his framework is really one that you'll find very useful. It's the epitome of constructivist teaching, really.
Yeah. Thanks. We will definitely put some links to Michael's work through the show notes in the podcast so that we can, point people in the direction of some of that. And you're right. There is a big body of knowledge. I just wanted to go right back to where you were talking about, where the teacher said, come and see what we're doing in classrooms. So
before you try to tell us what to do.
Yes,
that was his point. He was offended.
Yes,
really.
Yes.
That some gormless academic would try to tell him what to do when he never really had been in a classroom to see what he did do. Yeah.
Yes, and I think that's why your work, just resonates with teachers so strongly, is because it is of your findings from classrooms. So that's what we'll keep working with that, Brian, of the things. So when you were looking in classrooms, so you were really, so the three things that Halliday talked about, you kind of connected to that. So we learn language.
You learn through language. And learn about language simultaneously.
Yeah.
So you can't really compartmentalise.
Yeah.
If you're going to make those things happen simultaneously, then you've got to create really very special kinds of learning opportunities in your classroom.
Yeah.
Which means really changing how you spread yourself across the classroom. It means changing how you set up the furniture. There's a whole ecology there that you have to be able to manipulate to put Halliday's trifecta in action.
In your summaries, actually, of research, that you sort of found some of the things that theory builders and, had developed to really try and explain why some children found learning more difficult than others, and the kinds of things that we were saying. So you had this little list of things like effective users of writing are genetically different, which of course they aren't.
Well, as I reviewed the literature and synthesised it, I found that there were certain arguments being put forward by different schools of thinking about how to teach writing that explained why some kids would have difficulty in learning to write.
Yes.
And of course, one of those theories was that effective writers are simply smarter than those who don't learn to write successfully. So anybody who's an effective writer, according to this theory, is more intelligent than those who can't. And some have even suggested they're born with a unique gene, which has got a number, but I can't remember what it is, that confers a special creativity and love of words for them. Or they have a genetically predetermined personality that enables them to engage with and enjoy mastering all the tedious spelling and grammar and punctuation, so on, conventions. Yeah. Well, I think, as I say in the article, I can find no empirical evidence that supports that at all. The successful authors are no more intelligent, do score not higher on tests of creativity than the population of non-authors, and nor do they have different personality profiles. And not all of them are expert spellers, grammarians or punctuators. I think it was James Michener who wrote those famous books, Hawaii, and he was a terrible speller.
Yes,
so was Roald Dahl. He couldn't spell either.
Yeah.
So that notion that in order to be an effective writer, you have to be born with a gene and a certain personality just doesn't stand up to them. And then there was those who argued that in order to be an effective writer, then it's just practice, practice, practice. You know, the old cliche, practice makes perfect.
Yep.
And I found there were a lot of educators and professional developers and even the community of general public, parents and so on, just thought that effective learning or mastering complex knowledge or skills was just like training for swimming or athletics. You know, you just get in the pool and you practice, 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 and you get some feedback from your coach, and then you become better. Now that might work for athletes, but it doesn't. It's not possible for writers, effective users of writing, in the time they have available, to internalise all the complex knowledge and skills that effective writers have to learn. You know, it would take the whole of their lifetime, 24 hours a day, to really practice all of the complexities that are involved in being able to write something. You know, just being able to write something like a birthday invitation means you have to have a whole lot of knowledge about font size and message and type and where you place it on the page and so on. Yeah. You can perhaps teach how to do that by through practice, but when you think of all of the other things that you have to learn to be an effective user of writing in a whole lot of other contexts, then it's just impossible. I think it was Frank Smith who said, I've got a quote there, I'll just read his quote. I thought the answer must be that we learn to write by writing. That was Frank's great aphorism, until I reflected on how little anyone actually writes in schools, even the eager students, and how little feedback is provided. Errors may be corrected, but how often are correct models provided, especially beyond the level of words? How often is such feedback consulted and acted upon, especially by those who need the corrections most? No one writes enough to learn more than a small part of what writers have to know. And I think that's terribly important. Yeah. No one writes enough to learn more than a small part of writers have to know. So you have to ask the question, if it's not genetics or it's the same practice that gets all of this complex knowledge inside kids' heads, then what's the only activity they engage in that makes that possible? And I think reading.
Yeah.
Reading is the only activity that I can find that humans do that would at least give them some an opportunity of internalising some of the skills of making meaning using symbols that writers need to know.
Yeah.
Direct instruction won't do it. Genetics won't do it. So we've got to just get them to read as much as possible, and from that they will internalise what it is that they need to know in order to write. So, in order to write magazine articles, Frank Smith says, read magazines, read lots of them. If you want to write a textbook in physics, go and read textbooks in physics. And that's how you'll internalise what it is you need to know.
So writing really can't live, or writers, or the use of writing really can't live without reading.
No.
So,
Currently, that's the strongest theory that's available. Now, theories are always changing, but I can't think of anything else that any other behaviour that humans currently engage in that would provide the opportunities for them to learn what it is that effective writers have obviously learned and internalised.
Yeah. So then we think about, okay, what does that look like in a classroom then? So that's something that you looked at. You were able to look at those classrooms where students were using writing effectively. And I think one of the things that we'll often hear, any of us in a classroom will say, how do we have time? And that's the one thing that you related, right at the beginning, that writing, we don't have enough time, to learn all of those things that are needed to know about writing, to be highly effective at it. And of course, that's where the analogy with, a sport, if we dedicate ourselves to a sport, we're practicing a lot of the time of the day, to become expert in that. So in a classroom, and this is probably the most frequently asked question that I get too, is, how do we fit everything into a day but that's when people are thinking of it in a compartmentalised way. How do I fit this and that and everything else into the day? So you were able to really see in classrooms how were teachers most effectively enabling students to become good users of writing through the links that they were making to reading and other things. So can you talk us through the things that you've some of the hallmarks of the effective classrooms?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I did try to synthesise what I'd found out, and I've got a series of dot points there, I think, in the article.
Yes.
Where I've tried to summarise and synthesise those.
Yes.
And of course, the first one is the one that you alluded to. You must have dedicated time. You must put aside the time for students to engage in reading and writing every day. Every day there must be some reading and writing going on. And you have to make that commitment to yourself that when you draw up your timetable or your classroom organisation and design your classroom activities, you have to ensure that there's multiple opportunities for the students to engage in reading and writing in some way.
Yeah.
And some of the ways that you can do this are teachers reading aloud to students at least once a day, more often if you can. I think I described somewhere for Stephen Lane, who's been out here to do a few sessions,
yes,
an American literacy educator. He asked me to write a piece on the value of read aloud, and I came up with the notion that teachers read aloud is like a Swiss Army knife. It's got all of these opportunities to do things. Teachers reading aloud at least once a day, but twice a day. And I even found that pre-service teacher educating, pre-service teachers, pre-service teacher education students loved being read to. I used to read Winnie the Pooh to them. If they were very good for the first 45 minutes of my lecture, I promised them I'd read Winnie the Pooh, and they loved it. They demanded it after a while. So being read to is a behaviour, a practice that really enables you to do quite a lot of drawing attention to words, word shapes, pictures, grammar. As you read aloud to kids and you comment now and then and draw their attention to certain things, you're teaching them a heck of a lot about the way language works and the way texts are written.
Yes.
So I would encourage teachers reading aloud at least once a day, but more often if you can.
Yes, and across primary and secondary, and tertiary.
Tertiary.
Yeah.
I think when I first started working at Wollongong University, they asked me to set up a remedial writing centre for first-year students. What had happened was that the history lecturers and the sociology lecturers had found that when they gave their first-year students their first essay, the essays weren't what they expected. And, I would go to the council, the university council meetings once a month, and I'd hear the sociologists complaining that teachers don't teach kids how to write anymore, how to spell, and they don't know how to form sentences. We definitely need a facility within the university in order to overcome this. So I offered to take it on, and my method of dealing with it was to purchase a lot of bean bags, and I would bring them in, and I would, if they were sociology students, I'd do a teacher read aloud from a good sociology article.
Yes.
If they were history students, I'd do a teacher read aloud from what was alleged to be a first-class piece of history writing. I did that twice a week for 3 months and sent them back to their professors, and their professors wanted to know how I wrought the miracle.
And there it is, living out, as Frank Smith says, we learn from the company we keep.
That's right.
Yeah. Yes.
So the other things I noticed in these classrooms, teachers provided multiple opportunities for students to share and discuss the meanings that they created from the reading and writing opportunities that you provided for them. They always used real books, not basils or decodable texts for reading.
Yes.
They offered students some choice about what they wanted to read or write. The old Don Graves aphorism that if you own your writing, you take care of it, a bit like a person who owns a house or rents a house.
Yes.
Renters don't look after your house as you, the owner, would. So he was always advocating that teachers give kids choice about what they want to read or write, so that they felt they owned it.
Yes.
I found that the ecology, the physical ecology, the furniture was arranged in ways that supported collaborative writing, reading and discussion. Desks were set up in islands of 3 or 4 or 5, where kids just had to interact with each other while they were doing their different tasks.
Yes.
I can remember one kindergarten I was in where a teacher really had the teaching of writing. I think she she was an expert. She didn't know why, but what she did, she couldn't explain it theoretically, but she did really well. And I was sitting in this class, and the one kid at the desk said out loud to the rest of the kids at the desk, "How do you spell pajamas?" And one girl sitting at the same desk said, "Well, I don't know how you spell it correctly, but I've got a temporary spelling here that you can borrow if you want to use it."
Listen to that.
That's creating opportunities for kids to using the furniture in ways and creating an ethos or a climate where collaborative discussion and learning and sharing are really an important part of the day.
That's real. It's real community, isn't it? You know that collectively we are writers, and we share our what we need on that journey.
And what I found interesting about that response was that the teacher had obviously talked to these kids about temporary spellings.
Yes.
She didn't call them invented spellings.
No.
Which I think is a mistake.
Yes.
But, they're temporary. They're going to change. You'll get it later, but it's okay to use them. Was the message she gave these kids, and of course that freed them up. That gave them confidence to write without worrying about making sure it was correct.
Yes. There was another word the child used too. You know, you can borrow it if you like.
Yeah.
That notion of borrowing is actually the connection of why we bring the reading in for the writing, because what we are in essence borrowing from our experience in reading to transfer to our writing.
Yeah.
And so she was, modelling that very same. I mean, clearly the teacher had modelled that too, that we can, that it's part of the process is the borrowing. If we want to borrow that for now, that's what we do. So, until we own it more for ourselves. But the temporary, I absolutely agree with you there on the temporary versus invented, because invented means that I'm really just I'm not sure where I'm really pulling that from. I'm just creating that purely from imagination. Whereas temporary means this is what I've got at this point.
This is where I'm up to now.
Yes. Yeah. It's a wonderful word.
It provides wonderful opportunities, like for when a kid does have a temporary spelling for a word like, say, monkey. One of the common temporary spellings for a word like monkey is M-A-K-E.
Yes.
And when you think of the sounds involved in the word monkey, you can work out how the kids arrived at that. And so this teacher would use these opportunities to say, look, you've got all of the sounds there. We just write them a little differently when we're grown up. Would you like me to show you how we write that, what you've worked out there? And most of the kids would say, let's have a look.
Yes, that's it, because the temporary also lets them know that, yes, this is my best go at the word now, but I'm interested to know a bit more, let me see. And it's not seen as as a deficit piece, I didn't know that. Now I've got something more to add to my learning and my understanding. Yeah, the language we use as teachers with our students really shapes the way that they do the thinking and the trying and the using.
Yep. And this also involves teachers moving around the classroom constantly. I think Don Graves used to call it roving.
Yes.
Teachers roving around the room.
Yep.
using every opportunity to interact with small groups of kids or individuals.
Yes.
You know, so the kids would all be engaged in whatever learning activities she'd asked them to have a go at. And then she'd move around and talk with them, draw their attention to it, share things,
Yes.
you know, get them to share, stop what they're doing. I heard one teacher once say, everybody stop what they're doing straight away. I want you to listen. I want you to listen how Lee Min, a little Vietnamese girl, has spelt the word tobacco. And so Lee Min would stand up and share her spelling of tobacco, and then the kids would go back to work again.
Yes.
You know, it was that kind of lots of activity, movement and noise, but also teachers moving around the room and deliberately interacting with kids and looking for things to draw their attention to.
Yes.
Not in an instructional or teacher-centred way, but in you know, they would have to create, they would have to bond with their kids first, which is another aspect of that whole kind of classroom.
Yes.
The kids would have to really feel that they trusted that teacher and that teacher was really working for them to help them and wasn't a judge or an evaluator or a punisher.
No.
Yeah.
So that roving, I talk a lot. I talk a lot with teachers about that. You know, how we rove, because even so here, when you talk about that they'll rove and work with interact with small groups and individuals. There's been sort of a bit of a phase, I suppose, of really having students working in set groups. And only working with that one group at a time.
Yeah.
And the idea of roving is really that, all the on-the-spot teaching that can still happen because we rove is so powerful because it's happening right with the very thing that they're working with. And so that drawing, students out into a group with, okay, now we as a group are going to be working on this. That's often, just taking them away from the very business that we wanted them to be going on with. And then, we haven't got that opportunity as we work with them to necessarily, just join in with students in what they are doing, to be able to get them talking about what they're doing, to be able to share out across the class, like with that spelling of a word. So I think the roving, I love the word roving. I use it a lot because it really lets us be on the move and know that we're still moving students on with the very thing that they're doing. And that's when it's the most powerful. There's one you've got here that says that in these classrooms there is a low frequency of sustained periods of whole class teacher-centred instruction.
Yeah, and the message I try to get across with that was that I believe there are times during the day when you need to pull the whole class together. And that some teacher-centred instruction is okay.
Yeah. But
keep it as infrequent as you can and certainly don't build in sustained periods of it. It was a message where I was trying to give them permission to do it because I knew that teachers had to be able to do that sometimes and not feel guilty about it. Yeah.
Yes. And it's quite... that's really the short amount of instructional time is often what sets us up for, what we're off to do with independence. And it's an important point, that low frequency, not making it a whole lesson of instruction, because it really relates back to that first one where we want to make sure that we have got that dedicated time every day for students to be reading and writing.
Yeah.
And we can't get that. This is that, how do we find the time for these things? we find the time by taking less time as teacher for whole lesson types of instruction, and absolutely carving out and building in daily opportunities for them to read and write for themselves with choice.
One of the principles that Deborah and I put in our new book is that teaching is a response to learning, not vice versa. You have to get teachers to think that my job isn't to stand here and teach so that learning will result. My job is to listen to what the kids have learned, what they tell me, how they're learning, and then build my teaching strategies around what I learn from them, which is a hard thing for a lot of teachers to do. I know, when I first began teaching way back in 1956, you wouldn't be allowed to teach like that. It's just not, it wasn't kosher. You were expected to stand up and actually teach, and as a consequence of that, kids would learn. Giving kids the opportunity to let you know what they've learned and then building your lessons around that made it impossible to do a day book, is what my inspector told me.
Right.
If you're going to do a day book, you've got to have your lessons planned. Yeah.
Oh, so the day book, that was the lesson planner.
Yeah.
Right.
When I started teaching, that's what we called it. Yeah. Right. You had a book for each day, and you'd write down 9 o'clock, kids march in, 9:20 speech, 9:30 spelling.
Yes. Right. So just give me the line again from that you and Deborah. So teaching is a response.
Teaching is a response to learning.
Yes.
Not vice versa.
Yeah. So the organisation and the practice in those classrooms, I think they are very timely for us to reflect on as classroom teachers, as which of those things are I suppose, like you said, where is time for those things carved out? I find it a really nice little checklist of some of those things. The very first one, that dedicated time for students to read and write. I know you haven't numbered them, but without that piece, all the other pieces, all the other classroom organisations and practices don't have a place to live if that's not it's not in there. So I think that's the one thing that we really need to chase down is that time for how much time do we have for students to be involved in those practices. And that's what I hear a lot of teachers telling me at the moment is the day is filled up with, or the English block is, filled up with a lot of instruction, but not opportunities for use.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's the one that people would really, I like how the rest of your list really gives power to that very one, so that, less teaching time, more practice time. So maybe we can talk and finish off a little bit about, so how can we plan well? You sort of were talking a little bit about what your day book looked like, but as we think about as teachers that how do we plan to teach writing, in classrooms and even as schools, how do we think about how we have, because lots of schools that I work with, have that as part of their improvement plan, that they want to improve writing. So how might we think about that? If we're thinking about that as a school, what sorts of decisions might we make to say, okay, what can we do here to have our students being more effective users of writing?
And the original question was, how do we find the time, I think, was it?
Yes.
Yeah. One of the things that I found that I had to do to help teachers deal with this was to point out to them that a school day is about 6 hours, 5 or 6 hours, and the 5 days a week. So you've got about 35 or 36 hours during the week that you need to fill with learning activities that you hope will work. And so I would argue that rather than having a series of small lessons, when I taught in a one-teacher school, lower division lessons were never longer than 15 minutes. So I'd have a series of 15-minute lessons that would run through the day. I think it's what Don Graves once called the cha-cha-cha method of teaching. Cha-cha-cha, I teach this, and now we change the tune. Cha-cha-cha, I teach that. Yeah. I said, we've got to devote longer periods of sustained time for teaching literacy. And I said, if you take, most school days begin at 9 and they have playtime, recess time at 11, that's 2 hours. 5 days a week, that's 10 hours. So it's interesting that when I was doing this, the recommended time for teaching reading and literacy was 10 hours a week. But it was split up into all of these little compartmentalised lessons that added up to the 10 hours a week. I said, all right, well, you've got 2 hours every morning where you teach literacy. The whole 2 hours, no little lessons in between. And then after recess, you've got another hour and a half till lunch. That's where you can do math. You can teach math in the same way as you teach literacy, by creating opportunities for them to do and share and talk about the maths problems or activities that you ask them to do. And then after lunch, lunch is usually 12:30 to 1:30 in New South Wales schools. You've got about another 2 hours in the afternoon, and you can use that 2 hour block to do things like social science, PE. And I found that by getting them to think about using time that way, it practically forced them to integrate across subject areas. It took a while, and it took a bit of courage for them to persevere with it. I found I had to be in the classroom with them, and I'd watch them, and I'd take field notes, and then as soon as they finished, we'd go and sit down and have a cup of tea somewhere, and I would debrief them. I'd say, this is what I noticed. Why did you do this? Did you notice how that went? And so on. And it was through that feedback from the field notes that I'd taken that they began to develop the confidence to really use time this way. So it's it's extremely, it's a very complex field with lots of overlapping and interacting facets that all have to come together to work for a kid. And of course, the best model for that is learning how to talk the language of the culture into which you're born. I think there are the top linguists and psychologists and neurologists will tell you that we never learn anything as complex as our first language. But the way that we learn it, through the way that our caretakers look after us and respond to us, ensures that we will learn the language of our culture quickly and successfully. It's almost a fail-safe method that's been built in to ensure that most kids have a really good chance of learning to use the language of the culture into which they're born. And that's where the conditions of learning came from observing kids learning to talk.
Yes, yeah.
And, I used to wonder how... I remember I was in an amateur drama society as a teacher in one country town once, and I had to play the role of a Scotch butler, and I could not create the Scotch dialect at all, had no chance. And I thought, God, there's little Scotch kids walking around now who are perfect at that. How did they learn to do that? Yeah. How did they learn to talk like Scotch people?
Yes. And so, once more for us, we learn language. We
learn through language. And we learn about language simultaneously as we use language. Yeah. It's that simultaneously that's important, because you can't compartmentalise if all those things are happening simultaneously.
Yeah. So, one or two more questions for you. So, Brian, can writing live without reading when we teach? I know you've already answered that, but finish us up. Or I've got one more question after that, but just do a little summary piece about that then. Can writing live without reading when we teach?
I don't think it can, and I'm mindful of a book that I found in my wife's grandfather's locker when he died, and it was called the Manual for Teaching Writing.
Oh, wow!
In it, the authors had identified all of the social situations for which you might want to write a letter, because it was in the days of writing letters, so it was really a universal letter writer.
Yeah.
And so there were topics like letter from a young woman to a young man accepting engagement, accepting his proposal.
Oh, yes.
A letter from a young man to parents of a young woman for permission to begin courting. And there were literally thousands of these different letters.
Yes.
And my wife's grandfather, left school at 12 or something and became a coal miner. They were Welsh. He bought that because he knew he had to apply for jobs. He knew he might want to invite somebody to dinner.
Yes.
And every possible letter that he might need at that time to complete that social act was in this book. And that was because he wasn't a very good reader. I mean, all he read was the Bible. So, he could write good biblical letters. He was a primitive Methodist.
Yes. Yeah.
But he could write a good sermon for the local Methodist church. But that's all he read, so that's all he could write. And so for these other social needs, he needed to buy this rather... it was a very popular book. I often read through it now and have a really good chuckle at all of the social events that they needed to write for.
Yeah. So with can our children, or can we teach writing without reading? We know absolutely not. What we look for to to have our students reading, and you've already talked about this earlier on, but whatever we're wanting to so your wife's father had the book that had all the models in one book of every type of letter. And of course now our children and we as teachers are surrounded by such rich and wonderful examples of every type of literature, every type of text that's out there, that there is just such a wealth for teachers to draw on, isn't there, and to bring. But we need to also, as teachers, make sure that we're not only reading it aloud, but that we're actually bringing it and having our students access that as well, because they don't always have access to the types of texts or to examples of the kinds of things that they may want to be writing in. So I think that access is also another important part for us as teachers to be thinking about, not only that we read it to them and allow our students to be doing lots of reading, but to actually even be we're intentional in bringing a lot of these things to our children too, so that we can, build on. Well, I was working with a Year 6 teacher yesterday who's he has had a life in publishing before he became a teacher, and he had these two wonderful books written. They were biographies about two artists actually, but written from the point of view of somebody who knew them, and knew them well. And so of course they could write a good biography because they were actually good friends of these people. But just the way these books were written, the voice in them and the way they've been put together with photographs and drawings, and the way the text was organised on the page and the font style and how that sometimes, flowed across the page in a wave type arrangement. All of these things, just bringing those books out, he said, oh my goodness, for students to be reading these to see what a biography could look like. We were just so excited about these as incredible texts and these were, I'd never seen them before, but they came from his world of publishing. And we said, okay, are these still available? Because when we can bring such rich literature and rich examples to our students, and I think Frank Smith might have also been the one to say, you would know, or was it Graves that said, we can only write as well as the literature that surrounds us.
Yeah, I think it was probably Graves.
Yeah. So yes, reading and writing, and I loved, when you talked about that the time, if we think about it as that literacy block, as that body of time, not broken up into component parts so much, that we can really get a much richer thread of learning happening across that. So overall, Brian, what to sum up? Let's think about how might you sum up where we've gone today, what we've talked about. So we called it, your article's called Understanding Writing and Its Relationship to Reading, but of course it's all about enabling effective use of writing. So what might you say would be the main message for us then as teachers of, I'll go primary, secondary and tertiary?
All that I'd written before I get to the end of the chapter can be summarised as arguing that teachers need to use classroom language and practices which convince students that not only are they capable of learning to write, but it's also an exciting, interesting, satisfying and worthwhile enterprise. Writing's good.
Yeah.
And it's an enterprise which gives them both enjoyment and access to power, equity, justice, and the other accoutrements of the good life. I think if teachers can keep that in mind, that the way that they talk and act and interact and in the classroom, they're constantly giving the message that learning to write is exciting and interesting and worthwhile. It will further the purposes of your life. You will also enjoy it. And in order to do that, then teachers need to create classrooms where there are multiple overlapping reading, writing, speaking and listening opportunities.
Yep. Beautiful. And that's the piece. I hope people can replay that bit, because right there is the reason, like as teachers, what is, and even on our Australian curriculum, I think that message comes through pretty strongly.
Yeah.
That is what is writing really for?
Mm-hmm.
And to become a writer, it's all of those things. It's the power of it. It all hangs on the one word though, doesn't it? The use of writing.
Yep.
And so I love that you bring that to us in the article, that it really, your whole article and your conversation today is really about the why and the what of the use of writing and how we can really have that to live a good life.
Yeah.
Yeah. Fabulous. So let me just wrap up with thanking everyone for joining us today on the podcast. We love seeing so many of you that have subscribed to our episodes from all corners of the world, and we just love hearing back how that's impacted on you and the things that you've brought to your own students because of it. The Teachers Toolkit podcast is all about giving you an insider's guide to top teaching ideas, tools, techniques in literacy teaching and learning. Please subscribe to our weekly newsletter via the website. You'll receive advance notice on blogs, podcasts, events and ways to contact us. And today, thank you so much, Brian, for joining us, for sharing so generously of your knowledge. Your article will be linked in the show notes so that they can revisit that one. There is the book Made for Learning that you have written with Deborah Crouch that we absolutely recommend to people, along with I think you have a number of articles on the Foundation for Learning and Literacy site. Yeah. So people can absolutely tap into more of your really important insights into what it is to be in a classroom and seeing what works for our students. And that is so honouring the profession. Brian, you honour from that very first teacher that said, tell us, come and look at what we do to work out what's going to work. And I think that as a profession, that's something we all highly value, that when those who find out for us about what is effective and what works have done that by looking in at classrooms and looking at the work of teachers. So thank you so much for joining us, Brian, and all the best to you and to all of our listeners.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. To make sure you don't miss any literacy learning tips and insights, please subscribe to our show on your favourite podcast player. At Q Learning, our literacy specialists draw on over 30 years of teaching and international consulting experience to deliver world-class learning solutions. We equip, empower and support teachers to become their authentic selves. To find out about upcoming webinars and about how Q can help you and your school, visit qlearning.com.au. And you can get even more amazing teaching resources right now at teachific.com.au. Stay tuned.